Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong, even when you earned every right to be there? Imagine sitting in first class, calm and proud after a lifetime of hard work, only to be served a meal so spoiled it could make you sick. Not because of an accident, but because someone decided you didn't look the part. What would you do? Stay silent and swallow your dignity, or stand up not with anger, but with grace that forces the world to see the truth? That's exactly what happened to Darius Cole, a black CEO who boarded a routine flight home and ended up exposing the quiet cruelty that hides in plain sight. One calm decision at 30,000 feet would shake an entire industry, proving that power doesn't always need to shout sometimes. It only needs to stand. If you were him, would you have the strength to stay calm, or would you let the injustice consume you? Stay with me, because what Darius did next changed everything, not just for him, but for every passenger who's ever felt unseen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most. The hum of the engines was steady, like a low heartbeat inside the cabin of Orion Air Flight 227. The afternoon light poured through the oval windows, spilling over the polished silver of the first-class service tray. Every sound ice clinking in glasses, the soft shuffle of shoes on carpet seemed to pause when Darius Cole placed his business card on that tray. The flight attendant, Madison Clark, froze mid-motion. Her eyes flicked from the card to the man sitting in seat 2A. He was calm, composed, and frighteningly certain of what he had just said. "I'll personally oversee your termination once we land," Darius said quietly. No anger, no raised voice, just that slow, deliberate tone that carried the weight of truth. The cabin fell silent. A passenger in 3C stopped stirring her coffee. Another man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Madison swallowed hard, her lipstick trembling against the edge of her forced smile. "Excuse me," she stammered. Darius didn't repeat himself. He just leaned back, folded his hands over his lap, and looked out the window at the clouds below. The card on the tray gleamed in the soft light. It read Darius J., Cole Chief Executive Officer, Orion Dynamics Corporation. For 5 seconds, no one breathed. Then, somewhere down the aisle, a spoon clinked against porcelain. Madison's jaw tightened. "Sir, I don't understand. You don't have to," Darius said evenly. "But you will." The captain's voice broke over the intercom, unaware of what had just unfolded. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into New York shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." Darius adjusted his seatbelt calmly. The air in first class felt heavier now, like everyone was sitting under a storm cloud that had suddenly formed inside the cabin. As the plane began to lower, Darius's reflection in the window stared back at him, steady eyes, an expression of quiet restraint. He breathed in once, deeply, and closed his eyes. He could still taste the bitterness from that last exchange, the way Madison had laughed at him only an hour earlier. The image of the moldy sandwich flashed in his mind, the green edges curling, the smell faint but unmistakable. He had taken the picture, noted the time, and said nothing then, because silence, when measured, could be more powerful than outrage. Now, that silence was over. The announcement bell chimed again, pulling him back to the present. Darius unclipped his watch, sliding it into his jacket pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate. Madison stood stiffly near the galley, pretending to check inventory, but her hands were trembling. Across the aisle, Chloe Ramirez, the younger flight attendant, kept glancing toward Darius, her eyes filled with worry. She knew what had happened. She'd seen everything. She had even whispered, "I'm sorry," when Madison wasn't looking. Darius had nodded then, the same way he was nodding now. He didn't need apologies. He needed truth. The aircraft tilted slightly to the left as it lined up for descent. The skyline of Manhattan shimmered in the distant steel, glass, and December haze. Darius exhaled slowly. 8 hours ago, he thought. This was just another flight. 8 hours ago. He had been walking through the Seattle terminal, coffee in hand, gray wool coat over his arm, just another traveler. He had smiled at the gate agent, scanned his own ticket, and taken his seat quietly in 2A, no entourage, no assistants, no corporate badge. He liked traveling that way. It reminded him of before the billion-dollar valuations, before the investors, before the endless boardrooms where every word had a price. Sometimes he missed the simplicity of just being a man going home. But today was supposed to be simple too. He was heading to New York to give a keynote at the Leadership and Ethics Summit. His talk title, Integrity at Altitude, now felt painfully ironic. The seatbelt light blinked on. The engines softened their growl. Outside, the clouds parted in glowing sheets of gold and silver. Madison moved down the aisle one last time, forced smile in place, reciting her practiced landed checklist. When she reached Darius's row, she hesitated. "Mr. Cole," she began, voice shaking slightly. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." Darius turned his gaze toward her. His tone was measured, almost gentle. "Madison, the misunderstanding ended when you served a paying passenger spoiled food and mocked him for expecting respect." "I didn't," he raised a hand. "You did, and you weren't alone in seeing it. We'll address it after landing." His calmness frightened her more than shouting ever could. She stepped back, cheeks flushed. The woman in 3C Professor Evelyn Marsh watched the scene silently. Eyes sharp, phone in her lap recording the final moments. The plane shuddered softly as the wheels touched the runway. The sudden jolt made everyone sit up straighter. For a moment, Darius let the vibration hum through him. A kind of peace settled in. Justice, he thought, wasn't about volume. It was about clarity. When the engine slowed and the flight attendant announced arrival, Madison's voice cracked. "On behalf of Orion Air, thank you for flying with us." The irony of her words didn't escape anyone. As passengers stood, the murmurs began. Someone whispered, "He's the CEO." Another replied, "Yeah, of the whole company." Darius stayed seated, letting the aisle clear. Then he reached for his briefcase, adjusted his tie, and stood. Chloe came forward quietly. "Sir," she whispered, "what do you want me to do?" "Just tell the truth," he said softly. "Everything else will follow." The door of the plane opened with a hiss of cold airport air. The captain waited by the cockpit door, pale, unsure whether to speak. Darius walked past without a glance. At the threshold, he paused, turned back once. The tray still sat there on the counter, his business card gleaming against the light. He nodded toward it. "Keep that," he said to Madison. "You'll need to remember what it stands for." Then he stepped into the jet bridge. Outside, cameras weren't rolling yet. The world didn't know what had just happened, but it would, because truth, like altitude, could only be hidden for so long. And for Darius Cole, this flight was about to become more than a journey home. It was the beginning of something that would shake an entire industry. The rain had not yet stopped when Darius Cole arrived at SeaTac that morning. Seattle's winter drizzle came down in slow, silvery threads, painting the runways in reflections of light. He stood by the tall window in the lounge, sipping black coffee from a paper cup that had begun to soften at the rim. The sky outside was gray and restless, the kind of sky that promised a long day ahead. He always chose early flights, the quieter ones, where business travelers buried themselves in laptops and families were still half asleep. The anonymity of travel comforted him. No board meetings, no cameras, no reminders that the world saw him as a symbol instead of a man. On the boarding pass in his hand, the name read simply Mr. D. Cole. No title, no escort, just another passenger heading east. The gate agent called his group. Darius joined the short line, coat folded neatly over his arm, phone vibrating once with a message from his daughter. "Amara, text me when you land. Dad. And please eat real food." He smiled at the thought. She was 16 now, sharp and stubborn, already telling him to slow down and breathe. He texted back, "Promise," then added a small airplane emoji, something she always teased him about. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and rain. As he stepped onto the aircraft, he caught the familiar blend of coffee, carpet, and recycled air. Madison Clark stood at the entrance, hair pulled into a perfect bun, smile bright but mechanical. "Good morning," she said automatically, scanning his ticket. Her eyes flickered over the seat number 2A, then up to his face. Something about her expression changed, the smile tightening, curiosity fading into indifference. "Welcome aboard," she said, but her voice had cooled by several degrees. "Thank you," Darius replied, polite, even warm. He moved past her, aware of her gaze following him down the narrow aisle. He stowed his briefcase, slipped into his seat, and looked out the window as the last drops of rain slid down the glass. Around him, first-class passengers chatted about stock prices, ski trips, and weekend homes. No one paid attention to him, which suited him just fine. When Madison began her pre-flight routine, Darius noticed something small but telling. She offered orange juice to everyone in the first row, even the young man still fastening his belt, but skipped his seat entirely. He didn't react. Instead, he glanced toward the second attendant, Chloe Ramirez, who was setting up the service cart. Their eyes met briefly. She looked uneasy, as if she had noticed too. Darius pulled out a thin notebook from his coat pocket. On the inside cover, written in tidy ink, was a simple reminder he often carried: observe first, speak last. He jotted a small note, service inconsistency 752 and closed the notebook. The aircraft taxied out into the rain, engines humming beneath his feet. As the city disappeared under clouds, Darius let his mind drift. He thought about his speech waiting in New York leadership in the age of ethics. He had written it himself, as he always did. No publicist could capture his conviction that morality was not a strategy but a practice. He remembered his mother's voice when he was a boy in Houston. "Respect isn't about money, Darius. It's about how you treat the people who can't give you anything." Those words had built the spine of his life. At 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign blinked off. Madison's heels clicked softly on the aisle as she began beverage service. When she reached his row, she hesitated for half a breath too long. "Something to drink," she asked flatly. "Sparkling water." "Please," he said. She poured from the bottle, stopping before the glass was half full, and set it down without meeting his eyes. Tiny droplets of condensation rolled across the tray. "Thank you," he said anyway. She moved on without replying. Chloe passed a moment later, her tone far gentler. "If you need anything else, sir, just press the call button." He smiled. "I appreciate that." The engines deepened their tone as the plane climbed. Darius opened his tablet, reading through his keynote draft. The words stared back. "Integrity is tested in small spaces where no one is watching." He almost laughed at the irony. By mid-flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Madison's voice floated through the quiet, offering breakfast options. The choices were standard scrambled eggs or turkey sandwich. When she reached him, her smile had turned sharp again. "Sandwich? Yes. Please." She scribbled something on her pad and walked away. Across the aisle, she chatted casually with a passenger, a silver-haired businessman who joked about golf courses in Scottsdale. She laughed brightly, leaning closer. When she came back to Darius's row, her laughter vanished. Without a word, she placed a small tray on his table. The sandwich was wrapped in plastic, edges wilted, bread slightly damp. He peeled it open. A faint, sour smell rose. On the corner of the bread, a patch of green mold. He looked up. Madison was already halfway down the aisle. Darius sat still for a long moment, eyes fixed on the sandwich. He took out his phone, captured one clear photo, and tucked it away. He pressed the call light. Minutes passed. Nothing. He pressed it again. Finally, Chloe appeared, her face tightening when she saw the food. "Oh, no," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, sir. That shouldn't have been served." "I figured," Darius said quietly. "It's not your fault. I'll bring you something else right away. Don't," he said, "just note that it happened." Chloe hesitated. "Do you want to file a report? I will," he said, after landing. When Madison noticed Chloe lingering, she frowned and marched over. "Problem here," Chloe opened her mouth, but Darius spoke first. "No problem, just an observation." Madison's eyes narrowed. "Good, because we don't want unnecessary complaints. Do we?" The words hung there, sharp and heavy. Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Darius could feel their silence pressing around him. He smiled faintly. Complaints aren't unnecessary when they reveal truth. Madison's lips thinned, but she said nothing more. When she left, Chloe murmured, "She's been like this before." "You're not the first. I know," he said, "and you won't be the last to see it." He wrote another note in his book. Pattern observed intimidation after error. As the flight continued east, sunlight streamed through breaks in the clouds, glowing across his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth steady his pulse. The temptation to confront her right then was strong, but he remembered what his mentor once told him. Don't fight turbulence with panic. Adjust your altitude. So he adjusted. When the captain announced they would begin descent soon, Darius looked out the window again. The landscape below unfolded like a patchwork of snow and rivers. Somewhere beyond that horizon waited a stage, cameras, and a crowd expecting him to speak about fairness. How strange, he thought, that fairness could be so fragile at 30,000 feet. He closed his notebook. On the cover, his initials caught the sunlight. He straightened his tie, picked up the untouched sandwich, and placed it neatly on the tray table. He didn't feel anger now, only clarity. The flight was almost over, but his story was just beginning to rise. As the seatbelt light blinked on again, Chloe leaned close and whispered, "If anything happens, I'll stand with you." He looked at her with gratitude. Sometimes standing is all it takes. Outside, the sky turned the color of steel, the engines lowered their pitch, the city appearing beneath them like a map of flickering lights. Darius felt the plane descend through layers of air that trembled against the wings. He could already sense the reckoning waiting on the ground, a quiet storm gathering around truth, and he was ready for it. The sky outside the cabin was a deep stretch of blue now, clouds scattered like pale islands beneath the wings. Inside, everything looked calm, orderly, rows of seats, muted conversation, a hum of comfort that only first class could afford. Yet for Darius Cole, there was something else in the air, something heavier than cabin pressure. It was the quiet tension that followed after being made to feel small in a place where everyone pretended equality existed. Madison Clark moved up and down the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled this floating kingdom. Her uniform was immaculate, her tone sharp when she spoke to Chloe Ramirez, who trailed behind carrying trays. The hierarchy between them was visible in every glance. Madison's smile returned each time she addressed a white passenger, warm, practiced, safe. But when her eyes landed on Darius, it vanished, replaced by that polite indifference that stung far worse than outright hostility. He watched her interactions carefully, not out of paranoia, but because he'd spent years learning to read people. Bias, he had discovered, rarely announced itself. It lived in pauses, in tone, in the subtle tilt of a chin. He had seen it in boardrooms, in hiring committees, in the split second when people tried to decide whether he truly belonged. At 30,000 feet, it appeared again, smiling through lipstick, holding a tray. Madison stopped beside him briefly, collecting empty glasses. "Are you finished with that?" "Sir." Her voice carried no warmth, no curiosity, just the faintest emphasis on the word "sir" that made it sound less like respect and more like restraint. "Yes," Darius said simply. As she reached for the glass, her sleeve brushed his hand. She pulled back quickly, as though she'd touched something unclean. It was a small gesture, so fleeting that anyone else might have missed it. But Chloe, a few steps away, noticed. Her brows drew together in a quiet frown. Darius said nothing. He folded his napkin and placed it neatly on the tray. Silence could be sharper than words when used correctly. Across the aisle, Professor Evelyn Marsh watched, pretending to read a journal. She had seen it too, the stiffness, the tone. She made a mental note. Evelyn had taught corporate ethics for 20 years. She could recognize prejudice when it slipped behind professionalism. A few rows back, Ethan Wells, the lawyer, had been half asleep until a shift in Madison's voice caught his attention. He wasn't the kind of man who sought confrontation. He built his life around staying neutral, but even he could sense that something wasn't right. Still, like many others before him, he looked away and told himself it wasn't his place. The plane leveled out, and Madison began offering coffee refills. Darius's cup sat empty for 15 minutes as she bypassed him twice. When she finally approached, it was because Chloe had whispered something. Madison sighed audibly, turned back, and filled the cup only halfway before moving on. Darius smiled faintly, not because he found it amusing, but because it was so predictable. He wrote a note on his tablet. Service discrepancy continues. 9:46, Mum. Mr. Cole, Chloe said quietly as she passed. "I'm sorry about this. You have nothing to apologize for," he replied. His voice was soft but firm. "Just keep doing your job. That's courage enough." Chloe nodded, relief flickering across her face. For a moment, the noise of the engines filled the silence between them. Half an hour later, Madison returned with a tray of snack boxes, complimentary options, she announced brightly to the cabin. When she reached Darius's seat, her tone cooled again. "You can choose between the nut mix or the chips, but please don't request special items. We have to keep things equal for everyone." Darius looked up. "I didn't make any request." Her smile tightened. "Just making sure." He studied her expression. There was something underneath the professional mask, something defensive, perhaps even fear disguised as superiority. He chose the nut mix and said, "Thank you." She lingered a beat too long, waiting for irritation that never came. Then she turned sharply and walked away. Professor Marsh caught Darius's eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. A silent message, I saw that he returned it with the faintest tilt of his head. A small turbulence warning flickered overhead, and the cabin lights dimmed again. Outside, the sky began to pale at the edges as the aircraft crossed into daylight. Darius leaned his head back and let his thoughts drift. He wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger, he knew, burned fast and left ash. What he felt was older, quieter, a kind of fatigue that came from a lifetime of proving himself in rooms that were never built for him. But he had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something you waited for, it was something you carried, even through humiliation. He remembered his first job interview after graduating from MIT. The manager had told him, "You're impressive, but we're looking for someone who fits the culture." He had smiled then, the same way he smiled now, and replied, "I'll build a culture worth fitting." And he did. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll have a bit of light turbulence ahead, so please remain seated." Madison began her routine again, checking seat belts, adjusting curtains. When she came near Darius's row, she steadied herself by gripping his seat back, leaning close enough that he could hear her whisper. "You seem to be writing quite a bit. Mr. Cole, planning to send in a complaint." Her tone was saccharine but sharp. "I tend to document things that matter," he said evenly. "It helps me see patterns." She smirked. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." He met her eyes. "I already have." For the first time, her confidence wavered. She turned and walked away, muttering something under her breath. Chloe came by again a few minutes later, pretending to check the cabin temperature. "She's pushing boundaries," she said softly. "If she crosses a line, I'll step in." "You already did," Darius replied. "You noticed?" That simple acknowledgement made her smile. Just a little. As the turbulence faded, the captain's voice returned. Smoother this time. "We're back to stable conditions. Thank you for your patience." Ethan Wells finally looked up from his seat. The lawyer inside him itched to intervene, to say something, but fear of discomfort chained him down. He told himself that maybe the man in 2A didn't need defending, that maybe it wasn't serious. Yet, a strange guilt began to stir, the quiet kind that follows cowardice. Professor Marsh opened her laptop, typing quickly. She was preparing notes for her next lecture on ethical leadership, but her hands trembled slightly. The irony wasn't lost on her. An hour passed. The cabin grew drowsy with quiet. Darius gazed through the window, watching thin streaks of sunlight dance across the wings. His mind was calm, though his chest carried a heavy stillness. He had faced boardroom betrayals, legal threats, corporate wars, but nothing quite as personal as being made invisible by someone whose job was to serve all passengers equally. He took a slow breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth. His therapist had once told him that leadership demanded emotional endurance. "People will try to shrink you," she had said. "Don't hand them the scissors." He smiled to himself at the memory. When Madison returned with a new pot of coffee, her eyes met his for a fleeting moment. She seemed uneasy now, unsure how much he had observed, how far he might go. She refilled his cup without being asked, hands shaking just slightly. "Thank you," he said again, his tone unchanging. She nodded stiffly and moved on. The smallest things can shift the air. For the first time since takeoff, the cabin felt colder not from the temperature, but from the discomfort of a truth half the passengers could sense, but none dared name. Darius took one last note. Bias documented, respect withheld, resolve steady. He closed the tablet and rested his hand on top of it, as if sealing the record inside. He didn't know that the next hours would turn those quiet notes into national headlines. All he knew was that silence, like altitude, carried its own power, and his patience was almost at its limit. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft cut through a corridor of pale clouds. It was the kind of steady vibration that usually soothed passengers into half-sleep, but not today. There was something brittle about the air in the first class now, as if the oxygen itself carried tension. Conversations had quieted. Even the clinking of glasses sounded sharp. Darius Cole sat motionless, hands folded loosely on his lap. To anyone watching, he looked composed, detached, the way a man might appear when simply thinking through a business report. But inside, the currents of thought were faster, sharper. He wasn't angry, he was attentive. He had spent his entire life reading rooms that didn't welcome him, learning to translate subtle disrespect into patterns, and those patterns were appearing again. Madison Clark appeared at the front of the cabin, speaking softly with Captain Ryan Dawson through the half-open cockpit door. Her tone carried irritation, though the words were muffled by the engine's drone. She gestured toward the cabin, her manicured fingers slicing the air. The captain nodded once, frowning. When she turned back, her face wore that artificial calm again, but her shoulders were tight. Chloe Ramirez noticed the exchange. She had seen Madison's frustration building since the incident with the sandwich. The way her voice lost professionalism whenever Darius's name came up. Chloe wished she could tell her to stop before she crossed a line she couldn't return from. But she also knew that speaking against a senior attendant could cost her job, so she did the only thing she could: stay alert and wait for the moment when truth needed a witness. Madison started another service round, her expression fixed in that forced politeness. When she reached Darius's seat, she exhaled sharply through her nose. "Would you care for anything else?" Her tone carried the same energy as a dare. Darius looked up. "Just water." "Thank you." She filled his glass, too quickly this time, and the liquid splashed over his tray. "Oh," she said with exaggerated surprise. "I guess turbulence caught me." He dabbed the water with his napkin, eyes steady on hers. "Turbulence doesn't make you aim at only one passenger," he said evenly. Her mouth opened, then shut again. For a second, something flickered in her expression. Fear, maybe, but pride won out. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You think I'm afraid of a complaint? I've been in this job 12 years. I know how to handle people who make things about race." The words landed heavy, like a slap across the table. A woman in 3C looked up sharply. The lawyer, Ethan Wells, froze mid-page in his book. Chloe, at the far end of the aisle, inhaled quietly but didn't move. Darius's voice was calm, almost soft. "You should be careful how you define people. Madison, sometimes the person you dismiss is the one holding the keys to your sky." Her confidence wavered for half a breath. Then she straightened her shoulders. "Enjoy your water, sir," she said, and stalked off toward the galley. Professor Evelyn Marsh had seen the entire exchange. She slid her glasses higher on her nose and took out her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly, typing notes and timestamps. To her, what she had witnessed wasn't just rudeness, it was the anatomy of prejudice in real time, a perfect case study for her ethics class. Though this wasn't how she wanted to find her next example. Ethan Wells finally spoke. His voice low but clear. That was out of line. He said to no one in particular. Darius turned to him. "Thank you," he said simply. "Most people pretend not to notice." The lawyer gave a small, uncomfortable shrug. "I noticed. I just didn't expect it to go that far." "Neither did she," Darius said. His eyes went back to the window. Outside, the clouds looked calm, white as marble. Inside, the storm had already begun. Minutes passed. Madison's voice echoed faintly from the galley as she complained to another attendant. Chloe's face was pale as she stepped closer to Darius's seat. "Sir," she whispered, "she's saying you're harassing her. She told the captain you've been taking pictures and intimidating the crew. I've been documenting her behavior," Darius said. "But intimidation? No." Chloe swallowed. "I know. I'll tell the truth if they ask." He gave her a steady nod. "That's all anyone should do." The announcement chime sounded again, and Madison emerged, her smile too wide now. "Captain Dawson would like to speak with you." "Mr. Cole," she said sweetly, though her eyes betrayed triumph. Darius didn't move. "Then he can come to me." Her smile flickered. "It's a flight regulation matter, sir." "I'm aware of the regulations," he replied. "I also know there's no clause requiring a passenger to leave his seat for an unverified complaint." Passengers nearby began whispering. The tension was visible now, an invisible thread stretched taut across the cabin. Madison hesitated, then turned back toward the cockpit, her steps stiff. Evelyn Marsh leaned across the aisle. "You handled that better than most would." Darius smiled faintly. "The goal isn't to win arguments, it's to reveal them." When Madison disappeared behind the curtain, Chloe exhaled slowly. "She's losing control," she said. "People who build power on bias always do," Darius murmured. The next few minutes passed in uneasy quiet. Ethan scrolled his phone nervously. Pretending to read news articles while actually recording the cabin audio, he couldn't explain why, but something in him wanted proof in case things went worse. Evelyn pretended to type, her camera quietly angled toward the aisle. Chloe stood frozen, waiting for what she knew was coming. Madison returned, voice higher now. "The captain insists you comply, sir." Darius looked past her, toward the cockpit, then let him tell me himself. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Captain Dawson appeared at the curtain, his pilot's cap tucked under one arm, eyes tired. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "we've had a report of a disruptive situation. We just want to make sure everything's fine." Darius tilted his head slightly. Define disruptive. The captain shifted his weight. "A crew member feels you've been documenting her without consent. I've documented food that was unsafe and language that was discriminatory," Darius said. His tone was even, but his words carried steel. "If that's disruption, you have a bigger problem than turbulence." Captain Dawson hesitated, glancing at Madison, who stood behind him like a child caught lying. "Let's all take a breath," he said finally. "We're halfway to New York. We'll address everything properly after landing. That's the first sensible thing I've heard today," Darius replied. As the captain turned away, Madison's face reddened. She wanted to speak, but no words came. Darius reached into his jacket, pulled out his ID card black with silver lettering, the Orion Dynamics logo gleaming faintly, and placed it on the armrest. He didn't lift it high, didn't announce it. He just left it there, like a quiet storm warning. Chloe noticed. Her breath caught. The rest of the flight dragged in uneasy silence. Passengers avoided eye contact. The hum of the engines felt louder than before. Madison disappeared into the galley, emerging only to hand out forms, avoiding seat 2A entirely. Darius used the time to write one more note. Not a complaint this time, but a reflection. Leadership is how you behave when no one else remembers their humanity. He closed the tablet, his expression unreadable. By the time the plane began its descent toward New York, the sun had turned gold through the windows. The light fell across his face, soft and resolute. He looked almost peaceful, but inside, a decision had settled like stone. Madison glanced at him one last time from the aisle. She didn't know yet that her career had just ended at 30,000 feet. Chloe walked past slowly, giving him a small, respectful nod. He returned it, just barely, an unspoken promise that truth was still intact. The seatbelt light flashed on. The city stretched below them, endless grids of movement and sound, waiting to receive this airborne conflict. Darius looked out the window and whispered to himself, "Justice doesn't shout. It lands quietly." He didn't know that within hours, his name, his calm, and that single business card would ripple through every newsroom in the country. The seatbelt sign had gone off again, and the air inside the cabin had taken on that lazy, drifting quiet that usually came halfway through a long flight. The world outside was a soft blur of light, clouds melting into one another, the sun spilling through in quiet beams. Yet inside the aircraft, beneath the hum of the engines, something invisible pulsed a rhythm of unease that neither time nor altitude could smooth. Madison Clark pushed the service cart forward, lips pressed tight, her fingers tapping an anxious rhythm on the handle. She had managed to keep her voice composed after her exchange with Darius, but her pride burned. No passenger, especially not one who refused to be cowed, had ever made her feel small in her own cabin. In 12 years of service, she had learned to control every detail of a flight, from the way she smiled to the way she dismissed those who didn't fit the first-class image she liked to project. But this man, calm, quiet, unshakable, had disrupted the balance she depended on. She opened a cooler drawer, removing the last of the pre-packed meals. The label read First Class Turkey Club, fresh daily. The bread inside looked dry, edges slightly dark. She frowned, ignoring it. It wasn't her job, she told herself, to check everything. She slid the container onto the tray and turned toward the aisle. Chloe Ramirez appeared from the back galley. "Do you want me to heat another entree? I think we still have a pasta left." Madison didn't look at her. "No, this is fine. He'll take what's served." Chloe hesitated. "Ma'am, I think this one's expired. It says yesterday's date." "I said it's fine," Madison snapped, her voice low but edged. "And don't question me in front of passengers again." Chloe's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back, her stomach heavy with guilt as Madison made her way toward seat 2A. Darius was reading from his tablet when the tray landed in front of him with a thud. "Here you go," Madison said curtly. He looked up, brows faintly raised. "Thank you." She didn't respond, already moving away. He unwrapped the sandwich, and the smell hit him immediately damp. Sour, unmistakably spoiled. He turned the bread slightly, catching sight of faint green patches where mold had begun to bloom. For a second, he just stared at it, expression unreadable. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and took one clear photo. Across the aisle, Professor Evelyn Marsh looked up from her notes. The sight of the sandwich was enough to make her grimace. "That's unacceptable," she murmured, mostly to herself. Ethan Wells, the lawyer, noticed too. He shifted in his seat, discomfort flickering across his face. He didn't want to be involved, but the injustice was so blatant it gnawed at him. Darius pressed the call button. The small chime broke the quiet. A light above his seat blinked. He waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. No one came. He pressed it again. Chloe appeared this time, her eyes widening when she saw the tray. "Oh no. I told her." She stopped herself, lowering her voice. "Sir, that shouldn't have been served." "I figured," Darius said softly. "Please, don't get yourself in trouble. Just note it." Chloe nodded, whispering, "Yes, sir." She looked genuinely embarrassed. Madison appeared suddenly behind her, a brittle smile fixed on her face. "Problem here?" Chloe stepped aside quickly. "No problem," Darius replied, his tone even. "Just trying to understand your quality control standards." Madison's lips curved slightly, almost mocking. "We do our best, but you can't expect perfection on every flight." "Perfection?" Darius asked, voice calm but layered. "I think the bar is a little lower than that. Maybe start with food that isn't rotting." Her nostrils flared. "I think you're exaggerating." He slid the tray forward slightly. "You're welcome to check for yourself." She glanced down, saw the mold, and stiffened. "That's just discoloration from storage." Darius met her gaze. "No, that's neglect." Madison's cheeks flushed red. Passengers nearby were beginning to watch. She forced a smile, leaned closer, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Maybe next time. Bring your own meal if you're going to be this particular." Chloe gasped softly. Evelyn's head snapped up. Darius didn't move. He just looked at her steady, unflinching. "I will make sure that suggestion reaches the top of your company." "Sir," she began, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "No more words." He said quietly, "You've said enough." The cabin fell silent. Madison turned away sharply, muttering something under her breath as she disappeared into the galley. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "That was incredible," he said under his breath. "You didn't even raise your voice." Darius gave a faint smile. "Noise isn't proof of power." Professor Marsh leaned across the aisle. "She's made a serious mistake," she said. "I've seen that kind of behavior before. It never ends well." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. That's true, but endings are choices. Chloe lingered near his row after the confrontation, pretending to check the seatbelt lights. "I'll back you up if you need a witness," she said softly. "Thank you." "Chloe," he said, using her name for the first time. "You already did enough by being honest." Her eyes softened. "Most people don't notice what's right in front of them." "Most people," Darius replied, "aren't brave enough to look." The next hour passed in heavy quiet. Madison stayed in the galley, her voice occasionally rising in frustrated whispers over the radio phone. Chloe busied herself with passengers, moving through the aisles like someone trying to restore balance after a storm. Darius leaned back, closed his eyes, and tried to steady his breathing. The rhythm of the engines was hypnotic, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. He remembered his mother's words again, the ones she'd said when he was a boy. "The hardest battles are the ones you fight politely." He hadn't understood them then, but now, at 30,000 feet, they made perfect sense. He opened his eyes and glanced at the moldy sandwich, still sitting untouched. He hadn't thrown it away. It sat there like evidence, like truth made visible. When Madison finally reappeared, she didn't look at him. She moved through the cabin collecting trays, her eyes fixed on everything except seat 2A. When she reached him, he spoke before she could. "Leave it," he said. "I'll take responsibility for its condition when we land." Her hand froze midair. "Excuse me, I'm keeping it," he said, his tone quiet but final. Madison's jaw tightened. She turned without replying and pushed the cart forward. Metal wheels squealing against the carpet. Evelyn Marsh whispered to Ethan, "He's not just a passenger. You can tell by the way he speaks he's someone with authority." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, someone who doesn't need to shout to make people listen." Outside. The light was fading into the soft amber of early evening. The plane cruised through thin layers of clouds that shimmered like silk. Darius looked out the window, the reflection of the tray faintly visible beside his own. The sandwich sat there quietly, but its presence carried weight. He opened his notebook again and wrote a single line. "Respect isn't about titles. It's about how we treat the unseen." He closed it and leaned back, feeling the hum of the engines beneath his seat. Around him, the cabin began to prepare for descent. Passengers stirred, conversations resumed in cautious murmurs. Yet, beneath the surface calm, everyone could feel it, the atmosphere of something unresolved. Madison's voice came through the speaker, cheerful but trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 40 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts." Darius took a deep breath. 40 minutes to New York. 40 minutes until this quiet humiliation would meet daylight. He didn't yet know what form justice would take, but he knew one thing: it was coming. He looked once more at the tray, the mold like green bruises against white bread. Then he whispered to himself, "Every system reveals itself when you stop pretending it's fine." Chloe heard him but said nothing. She just smiled faintly and walked on, her heart quietly aligning with his words. The cabin lights dimmed as the sun began to fade outside, streaks of orange and violet painting the edges of the clouds. A low chime signaled the start of the descent into dusk. But inside the aircraft, the quiet had turned uneasy. It wasn't the stillness of peace, it was the stillness of people waiting for something to happen. Passengers who had spent most of the flight ignoring what was going on were now exchanging glances. their curiosity sharpened by tension. Madison Clark stood near the galley, pretending to organize trays, though her movements were jerky. Her hands trembled slightly as she stacked cups, the sound of plastic tapping against metal echoing louder than it should. Every few seconds, she glanced toward seat 2A, where Darius Cole sat motionless, his face calm, eyes half closed. To her, that calm felt like defiance. She hated it. Chloe Ramirez stood on the opposite side, wiping the counter with slow, steady motions. She had seen Madison make mistakes before snapping at passengers, gossiping about coworkers, but never something like this. Something inside Chloe had shifted since she saw the sandwich. Since she heard Madison whisper those words that could strip dignity from anyone. Now. As the air thickened with unspoken words, Chloe realized silence could be complicity. Professor Evelyn Marsh adjusted her reading glasses, then set her tablet on her lap. She had been typing notes for nearly half an hour, documenting the sequence of events, time, words, tone, behavior. It wasn't just instinct, it was her profession. She understood that injustice didn't need shouting to be real. It could unfold in whispers, in polite cruelty, in the way a person was made to feel smaller with every passing moment. She looked at Darius now and saw not just a victim, but a man who had chosen to remain composed when he had every reason not to. Ethan Wells had finally put away his phone. His conscience had been wrestling with itself since the incident began. He had watched people like Madison before, in courtrooms, in offices, in restaurants, people who hid their prejudice under professional masks, and he had told himself, again and again, "It's not my place." But now, as he watched Darius sit with quiet dignity, he felt ashamed of that phrase. Maybe it was his place. Maybe it was everyone's. Madison turned abruptly. "Chloe," she said sharply, "I need you to collect that man's tray now. He's holding up cleanup." Chloe hesitated. "He asked to keep it." "Ma'am, he said he'll take responsibility." Madison's voice rose slightly. "That's not allowed. It's company policy." "I don't think there's any rule about there is," Madison snapped, stepping closer. "And if you want to keep your job, you'll do as you're told." The words struck hard, and Chloe flinched. But then something steadied inside her. She had been quiet all day. Too quiet. And she suddenly realized she couldn't be any more. "Ma'am," she said softly but clearly, "you're wrong, and I won't lie for you." Madison's jaw dropped. "Excuse me," Chloe looked her straight in the eye. "You served spoiled food to a passenger, ignored his call light, and mocked him. I won't help you cover that up." The sound carried farther than either of them expected. Several passengers turned their heads. A man in 1B murmured, "What's going on?" Madison's face flushed crimson. "Lower your voice," she hissed. "You're completely out of line." "I'm just telling the truth," Chloe said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice didn't waver. Professor Marsh stood. "She's not out of line," she said, calm and deliberate. "She's doing what decent people should do when they witness wrong." The cabin went still again, but this time the silence wasn't fear, it was awareness. Madison spun around. "You have no authority to interfere, ma'am." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Authority is a poor substitute for integrity." Darius looked up, his expression unreadable but his eyes alive with quiet respect. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He was watching a shift take place the moment when truth stopped being his alone to carry. Ethan finally stood as well. "I think it's time the captain knows what really happened," he said. His tone was steady now, his decision made. Madison's voice broke slightly. "This is ridiculous. You're all ganging up on me because that man keeps twisting things. He's been filming me, taking notes, making threats. I haven't raised my voice once," Darius said, finally speaking. His tone was level, his words simple but undeniable. I didn't need to. Something in his voice carried more weight than volume ever could. The words seemed to anchor the cabin, resetting the room's gravity. Chloe turned to him. "Sir, I'll go get the captain if you'd like." "Please do," Darius said, "but tell him to bring the head of the crew as well." Madison's mouth fell open. "You don't get to order my captain," Evelyn cut in gently. "Maybe you should listen for once, dear. It seems you've already underestimated this man enough for one lifetime." Madison's eyes darted between them all. "You people think you can." She stopped herself, realizing too late the phrase she had started. The passengers heard it. The words hung unfinished in the air like smoke. Darius didn't move. "Finish it," he said quietly. Her lips trembled. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," he said. "That's the difference between error and intent." The curtain rustled, and Captain Ryan Dawson appeared, face tight, eyes uncertain. "What's going on here?" Chloe spoke first. "Sir, there's been a problem with food service and a passenger was treated disrespectfully. It escalated when Ms. Clark made inappropriate remarks." Madison snapped. "She's lying," Evelyn interrupted again, holding up her tablet. "No, she isn't. I have the audio. Several of us heard her words clearly." The captain's eyes flickered between them all, then landed on Darius. "Sir, do you wish to file a complaint after landing?" "Not just a complaint," Darius said, voice even. "A formal review." The captain frowned slightly. "Uncomfortable." "Understood." Darius leaned back, folding his arms. "Until then, I expect professionalism from your staff. Can I count on that?" Captain Dawson swallowed. "Of course, sir." When he turned to leave, Madison reached for his sleeve. "Captain, you can't take their word over mine," but he stepped away. "We'll handle it on the ground," he said, his tone clipped. Madison's face crumbled. For the first time, she looked afraid. As the captain disappeared, Darius closed his eyes again, resting his head against the seat. The tension in the room didn't fade, but it transformed like static before a storm turns into thunder. Ethan sat down slowly, still watching Darius with quiet amazement. "You didn't even have to shout," he said again. "No," Darius replied. "I've learned that dignity speaks louder when you refuse to lose it." Chloe exhaled shakily, tears threatening to form but never falling. She whispered, "Thank you for staying calm. I don't know if I could have." He turned to her. "Courage doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like what you just did." The plane continued slicing through the sky, the lights of the East Coast glowing faintly below. For a while, no one spoke. The passengers who had been pretending to sleep now stared quietly ahead, each lost in thought. As the city lights came into view, the intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent into New York shortly," the captain announced. His voice was steady, but those who'd seen his face knew he was shaken. Darius looked out the window, the skyline a faint shimmer against the dark horizon. He could feel the weight of what had just happened, not victory, not satisfaction, but inevitability. When truth began to speak, the system would have to listen. Chloe walked by one last time before landing, her eyes meeting his. "I'll tell the truth," she said softly. "I know you will," he replied. Evelyn Marsh closed her tablet and smiled faintly. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I think the sky just found its conscience again." He gave a small nod, the corners of his mouth lifting. Sometimes it takes turbulence to remind us how high we should fly. The first hints of the city glimmered beneath the clouds, threads of golden light weaving through the dark. The plane began its descent, engines lowering in pitch, that familiar shift in gravity pressing everyone slightly into their seats. Normally, this would be the time passengers gathered their things, their minds already halfway home. But tonight, no one moved. All eyes, quiet and restless, kept flicking toward the man in seat 2A, toward Darius Cole. He hadn't said another word since the captain left. He simply sat there, hands resting calmly on the armrest, his breathing slow and deliberate, but his silence now carried weight, a steady, invisible power that seemed to anchor the entire cabin. Madison Clark, standing near the galley, pretended to review her paperwork, though her hands shook with each motion. She could feel her composure fraying, could feel eyes on her back. Chloe Ramirez kept her gaze down, collecting cups mechanically, though her mind raced. The captain had said they'd deal with it on the ground, but Chloe knew how that usually went. Complaints disappeared, reports got rewritten, the system protected its own, unless someone refused to let it. Evelyn Marsh broke the silence first, her voice low but deliberate. "When we land, I'll give my statement," she said to Darius. "You have witnesses. Mr. Cole, don't let them twist this." Darius glanced at her, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I appreciate that, Professor. But I'm not the one they should fear twisting things." Ethan Wells leaned across the aisle, his tone careful but sincere. "If you need legal support, I'll offer it. No fee. I don't think this ends on the runway." Darius studied him for a moment, then nodded, noted. The captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into New York's JFK Airport. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The cabin lights brightened slightly. The air felt different now, not tense like before, but charged, as if something unseen had been set in motion. Darius straightened his posture, fastening his belt. His phone buzzed softly in his jacket. He glanced down at the name on the screen, Naomi Sloan, Orion Legal Division. He didn't answer. Not yet. He simply typed a short message. "Prepare PR review. Possible civil violation midair. Land in 10. Madison caught sight of his phone out of the corner of her eye and felt her pulse quicken. She had assumed he was just another businessman, maybe a lawyer, but now, with the way people deferred to him, the poise he carried, it hit her that she'd been wrong. Terribly wrong. She reached for the intercom, whispering into it, "Captain, I think we have a problem. The passenger in 2A, he's not who we thought." The captain's voice came back, low and firm. "Ms. Clark, please return to your station. We'll speak once we're on the ground." Her hand trembled as she set the handset back down. Chloe stood nearby, watching quietly, her expression unreadable. Madison turned sharply. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Chloe blinked. "No, ma'am. Then stop staring at me like that." Madison hissed, voice cracking. "I'm not," Chloe said gently. "I'm just making sure you don't make things worse." The words hit harder than intended. Madison turned away, jaw tightening. a quiet tremor running through her fingers. The plane dipped lower through the clouds, the city lights swelling into view. The skyline stretched beneath them like a constellation brought to earth. A few passengers whispered prayers, others stared straight ahead, waiting for the landing gear to touch. When the wheels finally met the runway, there was a sudden jolt, soft, controlled, yet somehow momentous. The cabin exhaled collectively. But for Darius Cole, it wasn't relief that followed, it was purpose. As the plane slowed, Madison quickly grabbed the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." Her voice wavered slightly on the word welcome. The chime sounded. Passengers began gathering their belongings, but no one stood from first class, not yet. They were waiting to see what would happen. Captain Ryan Dawson emerged from the cockpit, his posture rigid, expression unreadable. 2 ground security officers followed him, their uniforms crisp, their movements precise. Madison stepped forward instantly. "Captain, I can explain everything," she began. "This passenger, he's been confrontational since the beginning. I tried to stay professional, but he—" "Stop," the captain said sharply, his voice lower than before. "Not here, not now." He turned to Darius. "Sir, we've contacted airport protocol to escort everyone calmly. You'll have the opportunity to file your statement in the terminal." Darius nodded slowly. "I'll do more than that." One of the officers stepped closer. "Sir, may we have your identification?" He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. From it, he withdrew a card and handed it over. The officer looked down, then blinked, confused. Orion Dynamics, he read aloud. "Sir, you're the CEO?" "Yes," Darius said, voice calm but firm, "and a major shareholder of Horizon Air Group, the company that owns this airline." The air left the room. Even the sound of the engines winding down seemed to fade. Madison's knees went weak. "I was on this flight to evaluate internal conduct reports," Darius continued. "But I didn't expect to become part of one." The captain's face drained of color. "Mr. Cole, I save it," Darius said, still calm. "You did your job. You stayed measured. That's more than I can say for your lead attendant." Madison opened her mouth, but no words came out. Darius stood, his movements precise, deliberate. He picked up the tray containing the moldy sandwich and handed it to the officer. "Evidence," he said simply. "Chain of custody applies." Evelyn Marsh rose quietly behind him, her tablet already in hand. "I have time-stamped recordings if necessary, and I have visual confirmation," Ethan added, including her remarks. Chloe looked pale but resolute. "And I'll testify to what happened." Madison's voice cracked. "You're all turning on me. You think he's the only one who matters," Darius said, turning to face her. "I think everyone matters. That's the point you missed." Her lips trembled, but she couldn't speak. Darius stepped past her slowly, his tone still composed. "When I land anywhere, I represent thousands of employees, engineers, scientists, custodians, drivers. Many of them look like me. They deserve to fly without being humiliated. So, Ms. Clark, consider this moment not a punishment but a lesson." He turned to the captain. "File the report. Effective immediately. She's suspended pending formal review. And, Captain Dawson, tell your HR director to expect my call by morning." The captain nodded weakly. "Understood, sir." Madison stood frozen, her pride collapsing into silence. Passengers began murmuring softly. Someone in 3C whispered, "That's justice." Another said, "Finally." Someone stood up, phones discreetly recorded, lights blinking in the dim cabin glow. Darius ignored the cameras. He wasn't performing for them. He was restoring balance in a space that had forgotten it. He paused before stepping off the plane, glancing once more toward Chloe. "Thank you," he said. "You reminded me that honesty still flies higher than fear." Chloe's eyes glistened. "You reminded me that silence can be dangerous." He nodded, then stepped into the jet bridge, the cool airport air greeting him like clarity. Behind him, the hum of whispers filled the cabin, the sound of justice taking its first breath. In the control tower above, the logs marked the arrival of Flight 417 at precisely 8:42 p.m. But for everyone who had witnessed what happened on board, that landing meant more than arrival. It was the start of something bigger, something that would ripple far beyond one flight. And as Darius walked through the quiet terminal, his phone buzzed again. Naomi Sloane's message appeared, "Board wants details. Press already calling." He typed back, "Let them call. This time, we're answering." The hum of the jet bridge was colder than the cabin had been, a sterile whisper of air rushing through metal walls. Darius Cole walked with steady steps, the dim overhead lights reflecting faintly on the polished floor. Behind him, the tension of the flight still hung in the air like residue. Passengers followed slowly, their murmurs rising in cautious tones, some whispering disbelief, others quiet admiration. Airport staff waited near the gate, 2 operations managers, 1 uniformed supervisor, and a woman in a navy suit with a silver badge. She looked composed, but her eyes sharpened the moment they landed on Darius. "Mr. Cole," she said quickly, stepping forward. "I'm Andrea Mercer, Director of Ground Operations. We received the captain's incident report. Is it true that it's true?" Darius interrupted gently. "Every word of it." Madison Clark emerged behind him, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. She tried to regain some semblance of authority, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was just doing my job." He took everything out of context. "These people," Darius turned slightly, his voice quiet but cutting through her excuses. "The only context that matters, Ms. Clark, is respect. You forgot that somewhere above the clouds." Andrea gestured toward a small private lounge. "Let's continue this inside, please. The media's already waiting downstairs." At that, Madison's eyes widened. Media. How? How did they know Ethan Wells, who had followed closely behind? Gave a small shrug. People talk fast when the internet listens. He wasn't wrong. Passengers had already posted fragments of the confrontation short clips, snippets of dialogue, even a photograph of the moldy sandwich. The story was spreading in real time, carried on a current of outrage and recognition. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere shifted. The room was quiet, the air conditioning humming softly. Darius took a seat at the long table, setting his tablet and phone down in front of him with deliberate calm. Evelyn Marsh and Chloe Ramirez sat nearby. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his lawyer's instinct already awake. Andrea cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole, first, on behalf of Horizon Air Group, I want to apologize for any misconduct experienced during your flight." "Apologies don't change systems," Darius said evenly. "I want accountability, not sympathy." Andrea nodded quickly. "Of course, we'll begin an immediate review. Ms. Clark will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Madison's voice cracked. You can't just suspend me based on video, witness statements, and your own words," Evelyn interrupted, her tone sharp but precise. "Yes, actually, they can." Madison turned toward Chloe. "And you're really going to stand there and betray me?" Chloe met her gaze, trembling but resolute. "Telling the truth isn't betrayal." The silence that followed was heavy, and in that quiet, Darius finally spoke again, his voice low but deliberate. "Ms. Mercer, you'll need to prepare a statement by morning. Transparency matters. I'm not interested in burying this under corporate language." Andrea blinked. "A statement publicly." "Yes," he said simply. "I built Orion Dynamics on integrity. We hold other corporations to high ethical standards. I won't let the company that carries our people home fall short." Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, if I may, we can frame this as a corrective action initiative, introduce policy change instead of simple punishment. That would strengthen the impact legally and ethically." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Draft it." Madison, pale and trembling, tried again. "You don't understand what this will do to me. One bad flight shouldn't define a career." "Then perhaps," Darius said softly, "you should have chosen to make this flight a better one." Her mouth fell open, but no words came. The realization hit her like turbulent, sharp, sudden, irreversible. Outside the room, faint sounds of voices echoed the low murmur of journalists, camera shutters clicking, security trying to hold the line. The world was waiting. Andrea's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, eyes widening. "Sir," she said to Darius, "CNN just picked up the story. It's already trending under the tag Jur Flight 407. Evelyn sighed quietly. The court of public conscience moves faster than the law these days. Darius leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Then let's make sure the truth gets there first." He unlocked his phone, opened his email, and began typing. Each word was measured, deliberate to all Horizon Air employees today, during my flight from Chicago to New York. I witnessed conduct that violated the fundamental principles of respect and equality. No title, uniform, or seniority excuses prejudice. We will address this transparently, with empathy, but also with consequences, effective immediately. Horizon will begin mandatory anti-bias training, onboard accountability cameras, and open channels for staff and passengers to report discrimination without fear. This incident is not just a mistake. It is an opportunity to rebuild trust in the skies. When he finished, he handed the phone to Andrea. "Distribute that statement within the hour." She nodded, her voice hushed. "Yes, sir." Chloe looked at him, eyes full of quiet admiration. "You turned something awful into a promise." He gave her a small smile. "That's how change begins. Not by shouting, but by rewriting the script." Madison looked away, her reflection trembling in the window glass. "You'll ruin me," she whispered. "No," Darius said gently. "You did that when you forgot kindness was part of the uniform." Evelyn folded her hands, her academic poise returning. "Mr. Cole, may I say something for your next statement?" "Go ahead," he said. She spoke softly, but with conviction. "Remind the public that discrimination doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it hides in smiles, policies, or silence. This was just one story, but people will see themselves in it. That's how movements start." He nodded slowly, the gravity of her words sinking in. "You're right, Professor. It's not just about what happened. It's about what keeps happening. Outside. Thunder rumbled faintly, distant but real. A storm was coming to New York that night, both literal and symbolic. Ethan looked up from his phone. The first news headlines are already live. Black CEO faces racism. Mid-flight then reveals he owns the airline. Darius smiled slightly, though there was no pride in it, just irony. The truth always lands harder than fiction. Andrea's radio crackled again. "Sir, airport press is requesting a comment before you leave the terminal." He stood, adjusting his jacket. "I'll give them one. Not for spectacle, just clarity." Chloe looked nervous. "They'll twist your words. Then I'll speak them carefully," he replied. They exited the lounge together, security forming a path through the small crowd that had gathered near the gate. Phones rose like stars, lights flashing. A young reporter stepped forward, microphone trembling slightly in her hand. "Mr. Cole, can you confirm what happened on Flight 417? Darius paused before the cameras, his voice calm, resonant, deliberate. "What happened tonight wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about everyone who's ever been made to feel smaller in a space they paid to belong in. We're changing that, and not tomorrow now." The room fell silent except for the rhythmic clicks of cameras. His voice carried beyond the walls, beyond the terminal, into the growing wave of online conversation that had already reached millions. As he turned to leave, Chloe's quiet whisper followed him. "You really meant every word, didn't you?" He glanced back at her, eyes steady, every single one, and then he walked into the night, past the glass doors that opened to the storm, the wind cool and electric against his face. Behind him, the story had already begun rewriting the industry he had helped build. Rain had begun to fall by the time Darius Cole stepped outside the terminal. The storm that had been building all evening now swept across the tarmac. Streaks of water gliding down the tall glass windows of the concourse. Each flash of lightning lit up the sky in short, dazzling bursts, brief moments of clarity before the world turned gray again. He paused at the edge of the awning, letting the cool air touch his face. Behind him, a wall of reporters waited, but for a moment, he just listened to the storm, to the hum of airport life, to the heavy quiet of consequence settling in. Inside, chaos had already taken hold. Andrea Mercer's phone buzzed nonstop. Her team was fielding calls from Horizon Air's headquarters, from PR agencies, from legal departments who suddenly found themselves scrambling to rewrite every press statement in the system. The airline's social feeds were flooded clips of Madison's confrontation, photos of Darius's composed face, passengers praising his calm and courage. One comment had already been shared 100,000 times. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stood there and let the truth embarrass itself. Chloe Ramirez stood near the gate window, watching the rain blur the city lights. She still felt the adrenaline from everything that had unfolded. A part of her couldn't believe it was over. Another part knew it wasn't. She saw Madison sitting alone near the end of the corridor, staring at her folded hands, her uniform disheveled, her confidence gone. There was no more fire in her voice, only a hollow quiet. The sound of realization creeping in. Evelyn Marsh approached Darius quietly, her umbrella already in hand. "The world's moving quickly," she said. "Half the news anchors in New York are asking for interviews before sunrise. I'm not giving any tonight." Darius replied. His voice carried the same calm authority as always. "This isn't about publicity. It's about principle." She nodded, smiling faintly. Principle will outlast noise. Still, you realize what you've done, don't you? This isn't just a flight incident anymore. You've started a conversation the country's been avoiding." He looked out at the wet runway. Then maybe it's time we stopped avoiding it. Ethan Wells joined them, holding a tablet that glowed with dozens of notifications. "You should see this," he said. "The statement went viral. Your words, 'no title,' 'uniform,' or 'seniority excuses prejudice' are everywhere. People are tagging it under Cole standard." Darius raised an eyebrow. "That's not a movement, that's just decency." Ethan smiled faintly. "Decency feels like revolution these days." Andrea appeared again, looking exhausted. "Mr. Cole, the board wants a meeting first thing in the morning, and the FAA is calling. They want to review procedural conduct from the crew." "Let them," Darius said simply. "Maybe the skies will be safer when people start paying attention." Madison rose unsteadily from her seat. Her voice came out thin, almost pleading. "Mr. Cole, please. I wasn't trying to humiliate you. I just—" He turned, his gaze steady. "You just assumed, and that assumption cost you the one thing uniform and authority can't give you: respect." She swallowed hard, tears welling. "Is there anything I can do to fix it?" "Fixing it starts with honesty," he said softly. "Not with me, but with yourself. Ask why you saw someone who didn't look like your idea of belonging and decided to remind him of it." She didn't reply. Her silence said enough. Chloe watched the exchange from a distance. There was something painful but necessary in it, like a wound being cleaned so it could finally heal. When Madison turned away, shoulders trembling, Chloe stepped closer to Darius. "Sir," she said quietly, "thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't." He looked at her, warmth softening his expression. "You stood too. Chloe, the world changes because of small acts like yours, not titles like mine." Evelyn smiled at that. "You know, I'm going to quote that line in my next lecture, then make sure they hear it," Darius said, not as a speech but as a challenge. Outside the terminal, the rain thickened. Cars splashed through puddles, headlights slicing through the wet darkness. Darius's driver pulled up near the curb, holding the door open. But before getting in, Darius turned back to look at the terminal once more. The glass wall shimmered with reflections, faces, flashes of cameras, the soft glow of screens capturing the moment he'd turned humiliation into accountability. "Sometimes justice isn't about winning," he murmured. "It's about witnessing." Evelyn tilted her umbrella slightly, "And you gave the world quite the view tonight." He smiled faintly and stepped into the car. As the sedan pulled away, the city opened before him a sea of lights and motion. His phone buzzed again. Naomi Sloan, his chief legal counsel, had sent another message: "Federal Ethics Commission request an interview. CNN and NBC competing for exclusives. Stock up 3.2%. He typed one sentence in response: "Schedule community statement tomorrow, not media." Naomi's reply came instantly: "You're serious, always." Meanwhile, inside the terminal, Chloe lingered a little longer. She wasn't ready to leave. She walked past Madison, who still sat in the corner, hands clasped tightly. For a moment, she almost pitied her. Almost. Then she remembered the look on Darius's face when he saw the spoiled meal, the mix of disbelief and composure, and the pity faded. She found Evelyn near the window, still observing the storm. "Do you think she'll learn from this?" Chloe asked quietly. Evelyn sighed. "Maybe. But even if she doesn't, everyone watching did. That's how change starts, through the witness. Andrea joined them, rubbing her temples. The board wants to issue a formal apology to Mr. Cole by dawn. But honestly, no press release can undo what people saw with their own eyes. Then don't try to undo it, Evelyn said. Amplify it. Let it mean something. For a moment, they all stood together in silence, watching the rain fall harder, washing the runway clean. Across the city, phones buzzed, screens lit up, and living rooms filled with breaking news. The headline crawled across every network within the hour. Flight 417 incident sparks corporate overhaul. CEO calls for industry-wide ethics reform. News anchors spoke his name with gravity. Talk shows debated it. Activists called it a turning point. Somewhere in Atlanta, a young black engineer replayed the clip of Darius standing tall in seat 2A and whispered to his son, "That's what grace under fire looks like." In Los Angeles, a former flight attendant wrote an open letter for every passenger who ever doubted their worth in first class. "Thank you, Mr. Cole, for reminding us what dignity looks like at 30,000 feet." Darius's phone vibrated nonstop through the night. Messages poured in from employees, allies, strangers. Some thanked him. Some confessed their own experiences. One message, from an older woman named Gloria Timmons, read simply, "I've been waiting 40 years to see someone do what you did. God bless you, son." He read it twice, then set the phone down. Outside his car window, the rain softened into mist. The city was quiet again, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence that comes after something shifts, the kind of stillness that follows the first crack of thunder before a long-needed storm. As he leaned back, exhaustion finally caught up with him. Yet beneath it was peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace that comes from acting when it mattered. He closed his eyes and whispered the same words his mother used to say before every test of faith: grace isn't weakness. It's power under control. Tomorrow, there would be statements, meetings, headlines, but tonight, somewhere above the rain, a truth had landed safely, and this time, it would stay grounded in justice. The sun rose over Manhattan like an afterthought, pale light brushing against the skyline. The city was already awake, screens flickering in apartments, voices spilling from news anchors, traffic rolling through damp streets still glistening from last night's rain. Inside a quiet corner office overlooking the East River, Darius Cole stood by the window, a cup of black coffee in hand. He hadn't slept much. He rarely did when things mattered. The events of Flight 417 had spread across the country overnight. His inbox overflowed letters from strangers, invitations from major networks, and messages from airline executives who suddenly remembered his name with remarkable warmth. But beneath all the noise, something deeper was happening. For the first time in years, the conversation wasn't about profit margins or stock movement. It was about humanity, about what decency should look like when no one's watching. His assistant, Elena, entered quietly, tablet in hand. "Morning, Mr. Cole. The statement you issued last night has reached 28 million impressions. Cole Standard is still trending in 21 states. There's also the board." He turned, one eyebrow raised. "They're nervous. Not exactly divided," she said carefully. "Half of them think this is brilliant PR. The other half say it's a liability, too emotional, too risky." He smiled faintly. "When integrity feels risky, that's when it's most needed." Elena hesitated. Naomi Sloan's waiting in the conference room, and Andrea Mercer's dialed in from JFK. She said it's urgent. Darius set his cup down. Then, let's not keep the truth waiting. He walked into the conference room, the sound of his footsteps quiet against the marble floor. Naomi sat at the table, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of printed articles. She didn't look up when he entered. "You realize you've just rewritten half our corporate ethics manual overnight," she said. "I didn't rewrite it," he replied. "I reminded people why we wrote it in the first place." Andrea's face appeared on the screen, her voice slightly distorted through the call. "Sir, good morning. We've already suspended Madison Clark officially. The FAA has opened a review. But there's another development. You're being asked to appear at a press conference at noon." "I'll be there," Darius said. Naomi frowned. "With all respect, Darius, maybe you shouldn't. Let PR handle it. The narrative is already in your favor. One wrong phrase could shift it." "I'm not interested in narratives," he said calmly. "I'm interested in truth." Naomi sighed. "And truth doesn't trend as cleanly as hashtags." He smiled slightly. "Maybe that's why it matters more." Andrea cleared her throat. "There's something else. Chloe Ramirez, she's refusing media interviews, but she filed a detailed statement with the ethics board. It aligns perfectly with your version of events." "She's remarkable, sir. Brave." Darius nodded slowly. "Courage rarely announces itself. Remind her she's protected. No retaliation, no transfer." Naomi gave a small smirk. "You're already her hero. You know, social media's calling her the attendant who chose truth." He looked thoughtful. "She chose conscience. Heroes are what we make of people when we don't want to take responsibility ourselves." Outside the office windows, sunlight gleamed across the river. Darius stared at it for a long moment, his reflection ghosting against the glass. The city felt different today, like the world had paused, waiting to see what came next. At noon, the press conference began at Horizon Air's New York headquarters. Cameras crowded the atrium, journalists packed shoulder to shoulder. The air hummed with anticipation. Andrea stood at the podium first, reading a prepared statement about corporate accountability, policy reviews, and the implementation of an ethics in flight initiative. It was polished, professional, and completely forgettable. Then she stepped aside, and the room hushed as Darius Cole approached the microphone. He didn't bring notes. He never did. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice low but resonant. "Yesterday, I boarded a flight as a passenger, not as an executive. I sat quietly, expecting the same respect any traveler deserves. What I received instead was a reminder, an uncomfortable one, of how far we still have to go to make equality more than a slogan." He paused, letting the words breathe. Cameras clicked softly. What happened on Flight 4117 wasn't just an incident between two people. It was a mirror, a reflection of habits we've normalized, small biases that grow into barriers, silence that lets injustice pass as professionalism. He glanced briefly toward the back of the room, where Chloe stood among staff, her hands clasped tightly. One flight attendant chose to forget her humanity. Another chose to remember hers. That's the difference between arrogance and integrity. The room was silent now, every word sinking in. "I don't want this to be another viral headline," Darius continued. "I want it to be a turning point. So, we're implementing 3 permanent reforms. 1, every employee in Horizon Air, from the boardroom to the baggage handlers, will undergo mandatory bias and empathy training. 2. A new independent oversight committee will review all passenger complaints involving discrimination, and they'll report publicly. 3. No act of dignity, no matter how small, will ever go unrecognized again. Because justice, like flight, depends on balance. When he finished, there was a pause, not applause, not noise, just that heavy, electric stillness that followed meaning. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slowly, the sound spread until the entire room joined in. Naomi watched, shaking her head in reluctant admiration. "You know," she murmured to Andrea, "I almost hate how good he is at this." Andrea smiled faintly. "He's not performing. That's why it works." After the conference, Darius slipped away from the chaos of microphones and questions. He found Chloe standing near the corridor, still wearing her Navy uniform. She looked nervous. "You did well," he said. "I didn't do much," she replied quietly. "I just told the truth. Most people spend a lifetime avoiding that." Her eyes softened. "Are you really going to change the whole system because of this?" He smiled gently. "Not because of this. Because of everyone this represents." Evelyn Marsh approached from behind, holding a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Darius Cole turns flight scandal into industry reform." She handed it to him with a small grin. "You're officially a movement now." He chuckled lightly. "Let's hope it outlasts the headline cycle." "Headlines fade," Evelyn said. "Character doesn't." Later that evening, Darius sat alone in his office again, the city glowing outside. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from an anonymous employee, an air marshal who had been quietly watching the flight from economy. The message read, "Mr. Cole, I didn't intervene because I wanted to see how you'd handle it. You didn't just handle it, you led with grace. People like you remind me why rules exist in the first place." Darius set the phone down and looked out at the skyline again. The lights of New York shimmered on the river, golden ripples stretching toward the horizon. He thought of his mother again, her voice echoing from decades ago. "You don't change the world by shouting at it. Son, you change it by showing it how to behave." He smiled faintly. The city hummed beneath him, alive, restless, imperfect, but for the first time in a long while. It felt like it was listening. By the third day, the story had already crossed borders. News outlets in London, Sydney, and Johannesburg were running segments titled "The Flight That Changed the Skies." Darius Cole's name had become synonymous with quiet strength. His composed face captured mid-sentence, now an emblem of modern leadership. But in his Manhattan office, Darius wasn't watching the headlines. He was studying data emails, statements, transcripts from thousands of people who had written to him since that day. He scrolled through testimonials from flight attendants, mechanics, corporate employees, even passengers. Some shared gratitude, others their own hidden stories of humiliation or courage. One message, from a pilot named Samira Hassan, caught his attention. "I used to think keeping my head down was professionalism. You reminded me it's just another name for fear." He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the city seeping faintly through the glass walls. He knew this was bigger than him now. He hadn't started a movement on purpose, but once people saw truth, it spread on its own. Elena entered the room with a new stack of papers. "Mr. Cole, the Senate Transportation Committee has requested your presence for a hearing next month. They're launching an inquiry into racial bias in commercial aviation." He looked up slowly. They want to make it official. Then, very, she said. And Horizon's board wants you to represent the airline. They're calling you their face of reform. He gave a quiet chuckle. Irony has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Naomi Sloan stepped in behind her, holding a cup of tea instead of her usual coffee, a rare sign of exhaustion. You're about to make history. Darius, she said, but be ready. History bites back. There are people out there calling this reverse discrimination. Others are questioning your motives. He nodded. Change always offends the comfortable. Naomi sighed, and empowers the watchful. You've got eyes on you from every corner of the industry now. What's your next move? Darius turned toward the window, where the skyline shimmered under the morning sun. Not a move, he said softly. A direction. Later that afternoon, he visited the Horizon Training Center in Newark, a facility filled with simulators and classrooms where new attendants learned the basics of service, safety, and composure. For the first time, those lessons would include one more element: empathy. As Darius entered, the room fell quiet. Rows of trainees, men and women from all backgrounds, turned in their seats, whispering his name. Chloe Ramirez was standing at the front, now wearing a new uniform, her posture straighter, her face brighter. She had been officially promoted to senior flight attendant and appointed as part of the ethics and flight committee. When she saw him, she smiled nervously. "Mr. Cole," she said, "you actually came." "I said I would," he replied, his voice gentle. "I wanted to see where the next chapter begins." The trainees applauded softly, unsure if it was allowed. Darius waved them off with a smile. "Please, sit. I'm just here to listen." Chloe turned back to her group, speaking with growing confidence. "Before we talk about procedures or passengers, I want you to remember something. Kindness is policy too. It's not written in manuals, but it's the only rule that makes the others matter." Darius watched her with quiet pride. She was young, but she spoke with the conviction of someone who had learned courage the hard way. When the class ended, he stayed behind as she packed her notes. "You've grown," he said. She laughed lightly. "I think I just stopped being scared." He nodded. That's how leadership starts. For a moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then Chloe asked softly, "Do you ever feel tired of fighting the same battles over and over?" He smiled, eyes kind but weary. "Every day. But that's why you pass the torch, because someday you won't have to fight them alone." Later that evening, Evelyn Marsh called. Her voice was bright with the excitement of someone who had just seen a theory proven in real time. "You should know," she said, 3 universities have already added your speech to their ethics curricula. They're calling it the Cole Principle." "That wasn't my intention," he said, though he couldn't help but laugh softly. "I know," she replied. "That's what makes it work, across the city." Madison Clark sat in a small HR office, signing the final paperwork confirming her dismissal. Her once crisp uniform lay folded on the table. The headlines had destroyed her reputation overnight. She wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. The last few days had peeled away every layer of self-assurance she once wore like armor. And beneath it, she found something she didn't expect: regret. On her way out, she stopped at the staff bulletin board. A new flyer caught her eye: ethics in flight applications open for reformation training. She hesitated, staring at it for a long time. Then, quietly, She took one of the slips from the bottom, the number for registration. Meanwhile, at the Horizon headquarters, Darius met with Andrea Mercer and Ethan Wells to finalize the rollout of new programs. Ethan's legal team had crafted airtight anti-discrimination clauses for all airline contracts. Andrea had designed a mentorship initiative pairing junior staff with community advocates. It was policy with purpose, something rare in the corporate world. When they finished, Andrea looked up. "You know, Mr. Cole, this will set a precedent. Other airlines are already calling to ask about licensing our program." He smiled. "Good. Let them copy it. Change isn't worth much if it stays proprietary." Ethan chuckled. "Spoken like a man allergic to profit. Profit without purpose is debt," Darius said. "And I don't like owing the world anything." That night, the city glowed again, millions of lights, like stars caught in glass. Darius walked along the Hudson, coat collar turned up against the cold wind. He thought of his mother again, of the small kitchen where she used to tell him, "Dignity is how you speak when the world pretends not to hear." He had lived those words his entire life. But now, they finally made sense on a scale he hadn't imagined. A soft voice called behind him. He turned to see Evelyn approaching, her scarf fluttering in the wind. "You didn't tell me you were going for a walk," she said. "I didn't plan to." He replied, "Just needed air that doesn't come from a boardroom." They stood by the railing, looking at the water, the reflections of skyscrapers trembling on the surface. Evelyn spoke first. "Do you realize what you've done? People aren't just talking about a scandal anymore. They're talking about empathy as infrastructure. That's extraordinary." Darius smiled faintly. "Extraordinary things are just ordinary things done right for once." She nodded. "Still, I wonder how long until people forget." He looked out at the lights. "That's the thing about truth," he said softly. "Even when people forget the story, they remember how it made them feel." A small wave lapped against the dock, the sound soft and rhythmic. Somewhere in the distance, a plane crossed the night sky, its lights blinking steady, graceful. Evelyn followed his gaze. "You think she'll learn?" she asked, meaning Madison. "I hope so," he said, "because real reform isn't about punishing the guilty. It's about transforming them." For a long moment, they both watched the plane disappear into the clouds. The air smelled of rain again, but softer this time, like a promise instead of a warning. When Darius finally turned to leave, Evelyn called after him, "What's next for you?" He paused, smiling. Whatever comes after turbulence. 3 weeks later, Washington, D.C. was painted in late spring light, the air sweet with the faint scent of magnolias. Outside the Senate building, reporters crowded the marble steps, their cameras trained on the dark sedan pulling up to the curb. Darius Cole stepped out, crisp in a charcoal suit, calm as if the entire weight of public expectation hadn't been resting on his shoulders for days. He adjusted his tie, nodded politely to the flashing cameras, and walked through the double doors as if he had all the time in the world. Inside, the Senate Transportation Committee chamber was already packed. Lawmakers, journalists, and executives from several airlines filled the seats, murmuring under the high ceilings. Naomi Sloan walked beside him, tablet in hand, whispering last-minute details. "They'll try to trap you on policy contradictions," she warned. "Stay with the facts. Keep it human." "I don't plan to give them anything else," he said quietly. Chloe Ramirez was there too, seated 2 rows behind him. Horizon's board had invited her as a witness, though she looked overwhelmed by the attention. When Darius caught her eye, he gave a reassuring nod. Evelyn Marsh, now acting as an independent ethics advisor to the committee, sat near the front with a notepad already open, ready to record every word. The chairwoman rapped her gavel once. "This hearing will come to order. Mr. Cole, thank you for joining us. You've become something of a symbol these past weeks." He smiled faintly. "Symbols don't fix systems, Senator. People do." A ripple of quiet laughter softened the tension in the room. Then, as the formal questioning began, Darius's composure never faltered. When asked whether he believed racism was systemic in aviation, he answered simply, "I believe anything left unexamined grows in the dark." When asked whether firing one flight attendant solved anything, he replied, "One firing doesn't solve a disease. It signals the diagnosis." Each answer was clear, precise, grounded in truth without bitterness. He didn't accuse, he illuminated. The audience leaned in, captivated by the rhythm of his calm conviction. Halfway through, the chairwoman turned to Chloe. "Ms. Ramirez, you were on Flight 417 that evening. What made you speak up?" Chloe hesitated for a second, then said softly, "Because silence would have made me complicit. I saw something wrong, and I couldn't let fear be the loudest voice in the room." The chamber fell still. Evelyn's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Darius looked back, and their gazes met briefly, mentor and witness. Courage recognizing itself. When the hearing ended hours later, the applause that followed wasn't procedural. It was human. Senators, journalists, and even rival CEOs rose to shake Darius's hand. Cameras captured the moment, a man who had turned humiliation into reform, prejudice into progress. Outside, the day had turned golden. Reporters swarmed again, shouting questions, but Darius didn't answer immediately. He stopped at the steps, turned toward them, and raised his voice just enough to carry over the crowd. "This isn't about one flight or one airline," he said. "It's about all of us, how we see each other, how we treat each other, even 30,000 feet above the ground. The sky belongs to everyone. Let's make sure it feels that way." His words rippled outward, echoed on evening broadcasts, printed in headlines, replayed on phones across the world. The sky belongs to everyone. It became more than a phrase. It became a pledge. Weeks passed, and reforms followed. Airlines across the nation adopted Horizon's new protocols. The FAA integrated empathy modules into their certification training. The Cole Standard was no longer a hashtag, it was federal policy. Madison Clark, meanwhile, began attending the ethics and flight rehabilitation program she had once mocked. The first sessions were difficult. She sat among people who had also been dismissed for prejudice: pilots, attendants, supervisors, all forced to confront the small cruelties they'd justified as policy. At first, she resisted. Then, one afternoon, a guest lecturer walked in, Chloe Ramirez. Chloe didn't recognize her immediately. When she did, she paused but didn't falter. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Chloe said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I've seen what change looks like. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. But it's possible." Madison listened, tears burning quietly behind her eyes. She didn't speak that day, but something shifted. The next week, she came back early, notebook in hand. She started writing again, small reflections, apologies she'd never sent. Months later, she'd apply for a position in a community outreach program, working with youth to promote diversity and hospitality. And when the interviewer asked what had changed her life, she'd answer, "A flight that didn't go as planned." As for Darius, the world began to treat him as something between a corporate leader and a moral compass. Invitations poured in United Nations panels, global ethics conferences, commencement speeches. Yet he chose carefully. He avoided celebrity. Instead, he funded a foundation under Orion Dynamics' The Open Skies initiative to support minority students pursuing careers in aviation and hospitality. One evening, nearly 6 months after the incident, he found himself at JFK again, waiting at the same gate where everything had begun. He was flying to Los Angeles for the launch of the new Ethics in Flight training facility. Chloe was already on board, coordinating the crew for the inaugural journey. As he boarded, an older passenger recognized him and smiled warmly. "Mr. Cole," she said, "my grandson still talks about you. He watched your speech in civics class. Said it made him want to be a pilot." Darius chuckled softly. "Tell him the sky's wide open." When he reached his seat, first class. 2A. As always, he found a note tucked neatly under the armrest. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. "Dear Mr. Cole, you don't know me, but I'm here because of you. I used to think empathy was weakness. You showed the world its leadership. Thank you, a former flight attendant." He smiled quietly. He didn't need to see the name to know who had written it. The plane lifted into the twilight, the city shrinking below, the clouds glowing pink and gold. Darius leaned back, closed his eyes, and exhaled. It wasn't peace born of victory. It was peace born of purpose. Across the aisle, Chloe leaned toward him. "You ever think about how strange it is, how something ugly started all this?" He opened his eyes, looked out the window at the endless stretch of horizon. "Not strange," he said softly. "Necessary." As the aircraft leveled off, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Tonight's flight represents more than a journey. It's a reminder that respect is the air we share." The cabin was silent for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, passengers began to clap. Chloe smiled. "Looks like they're listening now." Darius nodded, the faintest warmth in his eyes. "Let's keep giving them reasons to." Far below, the lights of the city shimmered like constellations, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt as if it were moving toward something kinder. This story isn't just about one man or one flight. It's about what happens when grace meets injustice, when a person refuses to lose dignity, even while being disrespected. Darius Cole's calm strength reminds us that silence isn't weakness when it comes from wisdom. He didn't fight fire with rage. He let the truth reveal itself through his actions. In our daily lives, we all encounter moments that test our patience and principles. We can't control how others treat us, but we can control how we respond. True power isn't about dominance, it's about composure, empathy, and integrity. For older viewers who have seen decades of change, Darius's story is a quiet reminder that respect must never become negotiable. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing grace as armor. What he teaches us is simple, yet profound when faced with cruelty. Don't mirror it, outshine it, because character, once tested, becomes the legacy we leave behind. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like Darius Cole's remind us that empathy and courage can still change the world, one choice at a time. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful, heartfelt stories that spark reflection, justice, and hope. Stay kind, stay strong, and remember, dignity is the quietest form of power.